Hi everyone. I think we'll make a start. There might be a few people wandering in at the end, but that's fine. Well, at the end, at the start, I hope. But thank you again. This is our second research networking that we're doing in this format. It worked quite well last time, so hopefully it'll be another enjoyable and helpful format and session this evening, and we're hoping that we can do this more regularly, and the whole purpose of why we're doing it this way is not just for people to present their work, but actually for people to get into discussion groups as well, because that's sometimes where these little sparks of collaboration can happen, isn't it? So we're really pleased we had 6 excellent abstracts sent to us. It's always fascinating for us just to read what's going on around the square as well. And I just wanted to thank Sara, who's been doing all of the organisation behind the scenes here with Amy, and I think Amy's left us, but she keeps us all in line, and we're like herding cats, believe me, so she's great. So what the format will be is that we're going to invite the speakers up one by one. We have to be really strict with time. The intention is that this is a quick flavour of what people are doing, so it's fast presentations, and similar to what we're expected to do in conferences. So for those of you this may be new, it's great practice. And then what we will do at the end, once everybody has presented, we're going to position our speakers around the room, and then those of you who want to go and talk to one person or another, and then we've got the opportunity to move it around as well, can go and have a chat and see what emerges from that. So just to start off with, we'll invite people to come up, but we'll alternate. But the first person to come and speak is Holly Robson. Introduce yourself and your work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you. Nice to see everybody. Thank you for inviting me. I'm Holly. I work over in language and cognition in psychology at UCL, and I'm a speech therapist. It's nice to be here today. Thanks to CRN for inviting me and challenging me to present this work. It's not in my comfort zone. It's not my work. It's Claire and Melanie's. They did a qualitative project with the help of John, not a relation, who has living experience of aphasia, if that's how we say it. So, great. This is work that aims to explore how comprehension impairments after stroke manifest in real life. So what's the impact and how are people managing them at sort of the activity and participation level? And we care about that because comprehension impairments are under-researched, they are under-identified on standardised assessment, and they are a negative prognostic marker for impairment-based rehab. So we've got this kind of unmet need profile. I cared because most of my work uses neuroscience or neuropsychological methods to look at comprehension, and I thought that would be nice if it reflected something about real life. But don't have a functional measure of comprehension, and maybe that reflects wider things in lack of tools in the clinic. So Claire and Melanie conducted these semi-structured interviews with 4 people with aphasia of varying severities and 4 communication partners of people with severe aphasia. They co-designed them with John. They were lovely, kind of storytelling approach, and they conducted them on Zoom and did this reflexive thematic analysis. Please don't ask me about that. So, the data from this are really rich, and I don't really know what to present. One thing I'm pleased about is that they created this kind of what works set of resources for how people were managing their comprehension impairments, and they're in aphasia formats, and if anybody wants one, please let me know. I'll be very happy to give them to you. So these are kind of my highlights, I think. They identified 4 themes. The first they call spaces, places, and adaptations. And this is really about how the environment and communication partners can put in barriers or facilitators of comprehension. So here a participant says, slowly and different words, better. So this is a theme that basically aligns to kind of communication strategies that speech and language therapists would give. But it was kind of nice to see how they were working in the real world. So, sorry, it's small, so much data. We know things like the environment, background noise. That is a comprehension killer for people with aphasia. But people in the study were like, yeah, but, fun environments are noisy. We still want to be in those environments. It's just that now we have to maybe participate more passively. People talked about technology. So they cited some things that facilitated comprehension, like video conferencing, subtitles, but it was super Marmite. So some people loved it, some people couldn't get on with it at all. And everybody recognised that communication partner adaptations are beneficial. So this is stuff like changing the words you use, or repeating, or writing things down, or using gesture. Really helpful, but not trivial to implement in practice. And a great example of that is speech rate. So when you talk to people with aphasia, they'll say, oh, just slow down and I'll understand you. But sometimes when people try and slow down, their speech goes really weird. I don't know if you've tried. Articulation can go a bit bizarre, prosody goes all off, you've got word finding difficulties. So actually, sometimes not so helpful. The second theme, we call living well and keeping busy. So this participant says, so I love music. Music's really important to me. Art, food's important. So this is a theme which describes changes in activities or adaptations people are making to compensate for their comprehension issue by reducing the language burden, basically. And we got a series of lovely examples that people were doing. So people were taking up hiking or games or meditation and things like that. Really great ideas, but we recognise that obviously stroke comorbidity and sort of practicalities can limit your opportunities there. The third theme is about managing emotions and changing identities. So this was really emotional. It was about the personal impact of communication and comprehension issues. And this person says, talking about their comprehension problem, because it's making me feel disabled. And they don't like that, and it makes me feel vulnerable, so I try to avoid that. That's really, that's quite a powerful quote. And for me, it's even more powerful because that is a person with aphasia without a clinical comprehension issue. So fine on standardised testing, but still experience these negative emotional impacts in the real world. There were also positive emotions reported, particularly around kind of feelings of resilience when people had done an activity and in doing so had overcome their comprehension issue. And then the last one, they've called Knowing Me, Knowing You. And this is about forming and maintaining relationships, and particularly about the absolute critical importance of skilled and knowledgeable and experienced communication partners. So in this quote, the participant is talking about how his father hasn't been able to adapt to his aphasia, and he can't really comprehend him, but his mother and his brother have. So clever brother, mother clever, change, and I understand. So everyone says, skilled communication partners are brilliant, peers are brilliant, but the communication partners themselves basically said, well, we learned all of this by trial and error, not by clinical advice. And as a result of that, they were kind of left feeling like they must be missing a trick. There must be something else they should be doing to support their partners. And then the last thing is that obviously people found it harder to comprehend unfamiliar conversation partners. And this particularly came out in relation to healthcare settings, where I think there's a big mismatch between people's expectations and the reality of the clinical setting. And GPs got a real bashing, I'm afraid, from that. Yeah. Anyway, that's it. Some of these interviews were quite hard for me to listen to and read, but actually the overall message was really positive, which was that for this cohort of people, they were finding meaningful activities, and when they were being delivered in a kind of supportive way, those things were interacting to reduce the comprehension burden. And that did have positive psychological ramifications. Thanks.
Okay, brilliant. So thank you so much, Holly. Well, we might have what we might try and do is if there's any kind of urgent questions or anything that anyone would like to. Yeah. We've got like just a couple of minutes between each talk. Hope if everyone keeps to time. Otherwise, we can have more kind of obviously discussions later on. But does anyone have any specific questions that they wanted to ask Holly before our next speaker?
No pressure.
No. Yeah, go on.
So, Holly, what would you say about clinical language comprehension tools? What should we be doing?
In terms of them not reflecting daily life, perhaps this is, something that can be expanded from the research, and perhaps it's about asking people about their experiences and getting them to use more of a prompts type of measure, as we've been chatting about recently. It's probably a way to reflect the real environment in the clinic, by putting on increased pressure and time pressure and background noise and things like that. But I imagine that what's important is people's experiences. So measuring that reliably.
Yeah, got time for more.
I don't work in the medical field, so I'm very sorry for the incorrect terminology I'm about to use. But my great-grandmother suffered from a stroke and her language was severely affected, so she was very limited in what she could actually say. But she found that she had greater communication with other people in her stroke club that had very similar vocabulary to her. Is this something that is quite common, where people find that they're able to read people with a more limited vocabulary and kind of expression understanding a lot better?
Perhaps, they are naturally implementing those strategies, talking slowly, using higher frequency language, simpler sentence structures, possibly. And yeah, that's, I didn't talk about it, but it really came across in these interviews, the value of that peer support and how people appreciated that, and very lamentable loss of those services in COVID and post-COVID. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, brilliant. All right, thanks again, Holly. Okay, so if I invite up our next speaker, which is Sophie Roberts, and I'll open up the talk.
Okay, good evening everyone, and thank you very much to the CNR for having me. My name's Sophie, and I work on the PLORES research study, which is based here in Queen's Square, just over the road, and is led by Professor Kathy Price. PLORES stands for Predicting Language Outcome and Recovery After Stroke. And it's an ongoing study. It has two broad aims. The first is to understand individual variation in recovery from aphasia, and the second is to provide patients with individualised predictions about their language recovery. And as I said, the project is ongoing, and we're currently recruiting approximately 250 patients per year via the NIHR's Clinical Research Network. So today I'm just going to present some results from our existing data set and how these results are informing a new project that we want to conduct, which looks at how brain imaging can inform language therapy for aphasia. So, recovery from aphasia varies, and you can see this in the plot on the left, which shows 320 patients with severe aphasia 1 week post-stroke. So in this plot, the size of the blue bars represents the number of patients with aphasia, and going from left to right, we have 4 time points where their outcomes were recorded at 1 week, 1 month, 1 year, and 2 years post-stroke. And what you can see is at 2 years post-stroke, half of these patients have recovered their language to normal, and half of them still have aphasia. And so this shows us that recovery varies even when we control for initial severity. And this variation in recovery is the challenge that we are trying to understand. We have evidence that early clinical speech and language therapy facilitates recovery of speech production. So this is on the right. This was shown in a study I conducted during my PhD. If you look at the green bars, we can see that patients who received more hours of clinical therapy during the first 4 weeks post-stroke improved more compared to patients who didn't receive any speech and language therapy in this time. And this was shown when controlling for lots of other variables like initial severity. However, there were some limitations of this study, most notably that the measurement of therapy was estimated by patients themselves. It was self-reported, and so it lacks detail and also might be slightly inaccurate. So what we want to do now is to continue investigating the effects of speech and language therapy, but with much more detailed and richer data. And so we plan to collect this new therapy data from both patients and speech and language therapists about the amount, type, and timing of clinical therapy that they do, but also about any language practice that they do themselves at home, about their motivation and engagement with therapy, and about any social support, family support with that therapy. And one of our main questions is, how do therapy effects depend on other variables that influence language recovery? So, multiple variables account for a significant amount of variance in speech production outcomes, and here speech production refers to a spoken pitch description task. So in this plot on the left with the red bars, there are 5 significant variables that influence recovery and speech production. So those variables are left hemisphere lesion size, initial severity, semantic memory scores, education, and age at stroke. And you can see at the top, the variable that explains the most amount of variance is left hemisphere lesion size. And this effect is explored in a little more detail in the plot on the top right. So this shows, again, the blue bars represents the proportion of patients with aphasia 2 years post-stroke. And there are 5 groups for patients with different lesion sizes. So if you look in the group on the far left of the plot, these are patients who have the largest lesions in the left hemisphere, over 200 centimetres cubed. And you can see that almost all of these patients have aphasia 2 years post-stroke. Compare this to the group on the far right. These patients have the smallest lesions, less than 10 centimetres cubed, and almost all of these patients have recovered to normal by 2 years post-stroke. So these patients, we can confidently predict their speech production outcomes based on the size of the lesion in the left hemisphere. Going back to the plot on the left, the variable that explains the next largest amount of variance is initial severity. And again, this is explored in a bit more detail in the plot on the bottom right. So again, if you look at the group of patients on the left, these patients had the most severe aphasia at 1 week post-stroke. They weren't able to produce words 1 week post-stroke, and over half of them were still aphasic 2 years post-stroke. Compared to the 2 groups on the right, these patients were able to speak in sentences or more 1 week post-stroke, and almost all of them were not aphasic by 2 years post-stroke. So this is showing us that left hemisphere lesion size and initial severity both explain variation in language outcomes. However, that's not the whole story. There's one variable which we didn't include in these analyses, which is critical to consider, and that is lesion site. So, Kathy Price has identified 3 regions in the left hemisphere which are critical for speech production. And these are the areas highlighted in red, yellow, and blue on the brain scan images. And Kathy has shown that it's the degree of damage to each of these critical lesion sites that explains speech production outcomes, and explains them more accurately than just the size of the left hemisphere lesion in total. And this is shown again in a bit more detail in the plot on the bottom left. So the group of patients on the far left have the greatest degree of damage to each of those critical lesion sites. And you can see that over 90% of them, almost all of them, are aphasic 2 years post-stroke. Compare this to the group of patients at the very far right of the plot. These patients have preserved all of those 3 critical language regions, and almost all of them are not aphasic 2 years post-stroke. So the point that all of this is saying is that we can make confident predictions for patients on the basis of lesion site, lesion size, and initial severity. And if you look at the pie chart on the right, this shows the proportion of patients whose outcomes can be explained by these 3 variables. So going from the brown wedge round to the blue wedge, this represents 86% of patients who fall into a group whose outcomes we can predict on the basis of one of those 3 variables. And 75% of these patients' outcomes can be predicted by lesion site alone. So this emphasises the importance of lesion site when looking at recovery. So just to summarise and to bring it back to our investigation of therapy effects, we know that lesion site, lesion size and initial severity all explain independent variance in speech production outcomes. So what we want to do now is to look at the effect of therapy and investigate what the effect of therapy is when you control for these three variables, and also how does the effect of therapy depend on these three variables. And in doing so, we hope to be able to better understand the true effects of speech and language therapy. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time for a question. Yeah.
All right, so I might have missed this, but I'm trying to get a sense of how well the lesion data can explain outcome independently from initial impairment, because generally across language and motor, more severe initial impairment is associated with worse outcomes. So can it do prediction independently of initial impairment?
Lesion site. Can lesion site.
The anatomical data, how good is the anatomical data for predicting outcomes independently from initial impairment?
Yes, so I might defer to Kathy on this, but I think so this plot shows 75% of patients can be predicted by lesion site alone, independent of initial severity of impairments.
That's taking account of initial impairment, do you mean?
No, that's independent of. I think I'm going to defer to Kathy
So
here.
I was correcting for if it was a kind of linear regression or something, correct for baseline differences in initial impairment.
We would control for that in a linear regression. That's not what these data were done using, though.
So if your anatomical data correlate with your initial impairment, and then you say, well, the anatomical data predict outcome, it's the same as saying that the initial impairment predicts outcome, in which case you wouldn't need the brain scan. So it's like, what extra bit does the brain scan count for over and above what you can just test clinically? That's the question.
The red area here.
So there's something independent in the anatomy.
Independent, and when you match for initial severity, you only take patients who are matched for initial severity. Then that's that very first plot that, if you go back to the first slide, this is matched. Everybody has been matched for initial severity with 320 patients, all have no speech in 1 week. And if you match for that, you can predict outcome confidently depending on those lesion sites. If they preserve those lesion sites, they're going to recover. If they've knocked all of those lesion sites out, they're not going to recover. So it is independent, because initial severity has always got that cloud of data that doesn't quite fit the proportion of recovery line.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Thank you. So, the next speaker is Zainab Khan. I'll just get your...
Good evening, everyone. My name is Zainab. I'm a master's student here at UCL, and today I'm going to be talking about upper limb non-use in chronic stroke patients. So, as some of you may or may not know, upper limb impairment is a major issue in stroke, and more specifically, we also see non-use. So this is the mismatch between what a person perceives they can do in everyday daily life with their more affected arm versus what we as clinicians actually observe in assessments such as the Fugl-Meyer scores. And what's important to note is the fact that they perceive they can't do as much as they actually can in daily life. And this is important because it may eventually lead to functional decline, and this therefore negatively impacts the positive effects of neurorehabilitation. So although we've kind of like identified this association between non-use and neurorehabilitation, we don't actually still have a definition of what non-use is. And so we need to understand and define that before we even jump to like trying to understand what potential triggers of this phenomenon are. So previously in our lab with Mireia and Seb, they've used the kin arm, which is this exoskeleton, and the patient just sits down in a chair. It has 2 arm holders that allows the arms to move in a 2D plane. And what they're doing is they're playing a game to hit these balls before they reach the bottom of the screen. And over time, the speed at which these balls fall increase. And we have 2 versions. So we have the bimanual, so they're allowed to use both arms to hit the balls. And then we have unimanual, so they're only allowed to use one arm at a time. And how we kind of detect non-use is by looking at the arrest period. So arrest period is essentially moments of inactivity during this game. And what we're saying is that non-use is related to increased arrest periods. And for this portion, we had 20 participants. So initially, what we found was on the left-hand side, you can see how successful people have been able to hit those balls. So the blue indicates the left arm, the right indicates the right arm, and in a healthy participant, you would see that these blocks would be equal. So you would have an equal amount of blue and red. And also just to note that the white blocks indicate that those are the balls that have been missed. So what you also see over time is this kind of like funneling effect. So as the balls increase in speed, the range in which the arms move in the area reduces because it's more chaotic. So that's why you're seeing this funneling effect. And we can see that also in this graph here. So it shows that there's a big difference between the more affected arm and the less affected arm during this game. And the grey area around the graph indicates that this is a significant difference. And when we compare just the unimanual game, just looking at the more affected arm, you can see, again, there's a big difference in the game when you're allowed to use both arms versus when you're just forced to use your more affected arm. And this goes back to the fact that, again, you know, when we see in everyday life with people with a more affected arm, that they can actually do more than they think. But for some reason they don't, and that's what we need to start to understand. So with this kind of setup, we've shown that kinematics can detect non-use, and that we've shown with increasing task difficulty, which is when the balls increase in speed, that we trigger non-use. But there's a problem with this kind of setup. If you look here, we're comparing the bimanual to the unimanual, so we're looking at 2 arms versus 1 arm. The problem is, these games are very different. So in the bimanual, you have a whole screen, it's 170 centimeters, whereas in the unimanual, it's half that size. So is what we're seeing really non-use? You could argue it's just easier to play the game because there's less space for the arm to move. It can see the balls more easily because it's focusing on a smaller area. So they can hit the balls easily. It's also an issue because in the unimanual version of the game, it's not centered. It's either left or right, and it's placed on the same side as the arm being tested. So again, you could just say this is not non-use. It's just easier to hit the balls because you're not forcing the arm to reach out and hit the balls. It's easier because it's in the same side as the arm being tested. So what I did in my research is we changed this. So it's again the same setup with the kin arm, but in this case we have both the bimanual and the unimanual in a centered position, and the screens are also the same size. And in this round we had 24 chronic patients that we tested. And what you see again is a very similar result to beforehand. So again, when we just compare the more affected versus the less affected arm, you see there's still a significant difference. And this means that, you know, the less affected arm is just not functioning as well as the more affected in the bimanual game. But again, when we go to just forcing the person to use only one arm, when they're only forced to use the more affected arm, we see that the arrest period decreases. And this is because they're being forced to use their more affected arm. So this is suggesting that when they're forced to do it, they can actually hit more balls than they think. So it's this discrepancy that we're looking at, which is indicating non-use. So what this means for potential kind of clinical applications and how this helps us define non-use is the fact that when we see this discrepancy between the more affected and the less affected, and then comparing the more affected in 2 different kind of conditions, and there's a discrepancy, that's what a non-use is. And we can also say that the visual field doesn't impact our results. And yeah, that's my... Oh.
Thank you so much, Zainab. So we've got, you finished a little bit early, so well done. We've got a little bit of time if anyone does have any questions that they'd like to ask. Please raise your hand. Anybody? Yep, one at the back.
So what was the response to, of the patients when you informed them that actually you can do a lot more than you perceive?
So we don't inform them that they can do a lot more because, I mean, this is just, we only see them once. So it's too hard to say after we see them once, oh, you can do a lot more than you can. It could just be, you know, on that day, it might not necessarily be a constant progression, improvement. But I think they can themselves see when they're like playing the games. I mean, we have a discussion afterwards. They can see sometimes even just themselves reflecting on their own kind of performance. They're like, oh yeah, I can see that this is happening. And it really opens interesting discussions. But we don't inform them that, oh, you can do a lot more than you think you can. They can recognise it, yeah, some of them do, yeah.
Yep, one more.
Yeah, does original handedness have an effect on this?
No, it doesn't. No. Yeah.
Okay, yep, one last one, we've got time.
I just want to ask, do these games are just solely done in the labs? Can it be moved back to their homes and practice?
Oh, so this is just for the kin-arm, it's just on the kin-arm. I mean, we could potentially tailor it eventually or kind of like translate a kind of home version of this further down the line, but what you see is just available in that kind of kin-arm lab version, yeah.
Brilliant, all right, thank you very much. Okay. Okay, so I'd like to invite our next speaker, so Louise Penny and Claire from Imperial. Okay.
Hi everyone, we are from OnTrack. So we're going to talk to you today about OnTrack, which is the product, and we're also going to talk to you about the Upbeat trial. So I'm Claire, I'm from Imperial, I'm a policy fellow in behavioural science, my background's in social work, and I'm also the engagement lead for OnTrack, hence why you have me here. And I'm joined by Louise.
Hi, I'm Louise, I'm an occupational therapist at Imperial and co-PI for the Upbeat trial at Imperial.
Brilliant. So what is OnTrack, if we can move? There we go. Okay, so OnTrack is a platform, so we're interested in upper limb rehabilitation, and we have designed this with stroke survivors. We have built a bespoke algorithm that detects on a smartwatch whether or not that activity is purposeful or not. So essentially it works from a software perspective, so you wear it all day, you start the watch in the morning, get on with your daily activities, and over the day it will measure on that watch whether or not you're doing purposeful movement, which is very informative for how your recovery is. As I'm sure you all know, usually when you go to your assessment, how are you getting on? Good. And then you spend like an hour figuring what that looks like. Whereas this will actually capture that. So that's the first part. Then the second part is also the coaching element. So we like to say coach in your pocket. So your physiotherapist has provided that plan, and it's a 12-week rehabilitation tailored to the individual, so they're to their needs, which also can be adapted along the journey. It also has the OnTrack tools, which is for clinicians. So as I said, it's that insight. How is this patient actually getting on in their recovery? So it will track all of that and provide that on a platform that's compatible with NHS computers, I should also say. And yeah, it's now been registered as software as a medical device. We're also UKCA certified as well. So we're really proud that this was developed with stroke survivors who wore sensors in a lab in White City, and now we have it available for Upbeat. So I think, yeah, so Upbeat is then the trial. So we want to know, does this work? So this is a feasibility trial to evaluate OnTrack. So we're looking at a parallel group that's non-blinded randomized trial. Or we're comparing the OnTrack system with standard care versus standard care alone. So we're looking at this because we did an original trial which was just looking at proof of concept, whereas that was delivered by the research team, so likes of us at Imperial College, whereas the difference here with Upbeat is this is actually being delivered by clinicians, so the therapy teams, which is very different and more on the ground and embedded. So this is being delivered as if it was part of standard care in the NHS as well. So it fits that criteria for a complex intervention because it's got multiple interacting components, and therefore we're also doing a process evaluation in accordance to the MRC framework to evaluate, and we're also going to look at doing the analysis, so focus groups, we've got interviews, observations, and we'll also do a statistical analysis as well, which will then feed into our understanding of perceived accessibility, feasibility, acceptance levels. Does this work? Is there a burden? How can we tweak? Which makes us quite, more adaptable. And these methods then allow the triangulations of the multiple data sources of the theory as well to give us that in-depth understanding that I just mentioned.
So where are we at now? So across the 3 sites, we've recruited 37 participating therapists. So they've all been trained in the intervention. We have screened 297 patients just at Imperial. I unfortunately don't have the data for the other sites at the moment. We've recruited a total of 20 patients across all 3 sites. So that's Imperial, Hounslow and Richmond Community Healthcare and Central London Community Healthcare. 6 participants have completed all of the trial processes. 6 process evaluation observations have been completed for the therapist completing the intervention, and we've had 1 participant withdraw from the trial. So we've had some barriers and some facilitators throughout the trial. I think firstly, the biggest topic that's taken up most of our time and our kind of energy and our thinking has been slow recruitment rate. We really set our recruitment target quite high at the upper end of what we should probably be achieving. But we noticed that multiple patients were being screened out because they were still being seen by community therapy teams, but they weren't within the 6-month post-stroke period. So we extended out our recruitment to include patients up to 12 months post-stroke, just to include those patients as well. So next we changed the recruitment window as well. So we added an extra 8 weeks onto the recruitment window. There's still that has obviously had an impact on resource management and kind of trial management. Some of that is still being ironed out, so I'm not going to talk about that anymore. The recruiting therapist also felt that the consent form had quite a lot of burden in it. It was quite challenging for some of our patients, particularly at Imperial, where maybe our patients were more fatigued or struggling more to manage that. We did talk about changing the consent process, but actually we felt that the gains that we would achieve from that would not it wasn't worth that change, particularly in the context of some of that being mandated by the ethics. And also it would be a significant amendment to the trial. So the process would be quite lengthy for that. So we didn't go ahead with changing the consent process for the feasibility trial, but it is something we'll consider for next time. And then we also considered adding an additional site. So we could have had up to 5 sites. We've currently got 3. The R&D required for adding the additional site was felt to be too much again, because we would have only ended up with about 4 weeks of intervention from that new site. So again, we decided not to do that for this feasibility trial. The next kind of biggest aspect of kind of barriers was the research burden to clinicians. So as Claire said, initially the initial trial was run by the research teams rather than the clinicians. But actually the things that we did to mitigate, or the trial did to mitigate that, was Bridges self-management intervention and the PPI group developed specific intervention guides, and they were all customizable actually. So each clinician could adapt their guide so that it felt like an authentic intervention to them. Newsletters were helpful, and they were published about monthly with what's coming up in the trial, what's next, where we're at, and also giving kind of tips for intervention and tips for the trial and recruitment procedures. And then I think probably the thing that I found most helpful is the dedicated upbeat WhatsApp group. All sites are included, so sites that wouldn't necessarily work all that closely together. And that's been really great for kind of quick sharing of expertise, quick troubleshooting, quick problem solving. So yeah, that's been really helpful. And just some general facilitators. We've had a really active PPI group. They've been involved throughout the whole trial process, so from development all the way through to the trial management group meetings. And then also, there's been loads of stakeholder involvement in the initial design of the intervention, the design of the OnTrack device, the trial management meetings, and that ongoing relationship has been really helpful in terms of just kind of smoothing the process for that, which has been great. Sorry, I've rattled on really quickly. So I think identifying these barriers and facilitators now has been really good for our learning. Some of which you can see we've changed, some of which we haven't changed, but actually thinking ahead to our next, the future for Upbeat is to be thinking about a randomised control trial. And for that, we will be looking for collaborators, and we will be using these learning points within that next trial if we get the funding. So thank you for listening.
Okay, I'm going to take a quick chair's prerogative and ask one question, and then there'll be a quick one. Is that all right? So, the question I have is, you've obviously started to look at the process evaluation. You're starting to get feedback on barriers and facilitators. Are you doing this as a sort of a more structured, informed implementation inquiry in terms of stakeholder interviews? And it's fine to do that feasibility stage, because that might then help with your RCT.
I'll be honest, we're two very small cogs in a very big machine here.
I can answer that actually, yes, absolutely, because we're interested in eventually, there's no point making this and it sits on a shelf, right? So ultimately we want to get into the market, into the NHS, alongside the long pile of other interventions wanting to get in there. So yes, we are indeed asking those questions, and Bridges that are facilitating those conversations and having those interviews are building in the feasibility elements as well.
Yeah, and thinking about the implementation strategies, have you engaged with people to help with that side of things?
Yeah, so we actually are quite looking at as well as talking to procurement teams as well, so having a different strand and a different parallel project, but again that would all feed in, as you said, to like the RCT process.
Okay, I've got to think early. Okay, sorry, I will ask you
Yes,
later.
let's chat.
I did see Alex.
Sorry, two link questions. What sort of patients, is this for? What are their impairments, and what? I know it's feasibility, but what are your outcomes?
So our inclusion criteria is they have to be able to give consent. They have to have had a stroke within now 12 months. They have to have some level of upper limb weakness, although how much that is anything. And they have to be able to read English because they have to be able to engage with the prompts on the screen. So yeah, really broad criteria actually, which is why I think at Imperial we struggled with the consent is, I think, the biggest downfall.
I guess I can just quickly piggyback on that. Something, the really good example is from our PPIE group. There's a stroke survivor called Spencer, and he was always playing with his children and playing with a rugby ball. And since using OnTrack, he's built confidence in his impaired arm since his stroke to actually catch the rugby ball when it's thrown to him. So we're really looking at that impaired arm and building that confidence and that self-motivation that's part of the tracking. So I know that's quite research heavy what we've covered, but that is the going back to the why.
You're measuring impairment or confidence?
We're measuring the amount of confidence and the ability to try and not have an impaired arm by using, neuroplasticity and repetitive movements over the course of the day. So using your arm as much as possible.
I think.
Sorry, yeah. Do you want to go for that?
No, I was just going to say in terms of outcome measures, we're also using EQ5D, the MAL, and MRS.
MRS, yeah.
I feel like there's one more.
Okay.
Sorry, ever hogging.
I think we might have. There is what? Is it a quick step?
And yeah, just on that note, in the beginning you said we determine purposeful movements. I don't know whether this is gonna.
Yeah.
Question. How do you do that?
Yeah, so we built a classifier, so machine learning. So we basically are able to discount things like if you're on the tube and you're holding, that's not purposeful, you're just holding on. If you're holding a steering wheel, that's not purposeful, you're just holding on. So we built the classifier, which then the algorithm detects what's purposeful or what's not. So it's called the M2 classifier. I can talk.
So do they give feedback on the movement? Like I was just holding this, or do you have?
No, it's just the machine learning, so it detects whether or not it was purposeful.
Okay, I'm going to jump in, otherwise we're going to run out of time. And I know there's other questions, but we're going to go into the group so that you'll be able to ask lots of questions then. So sorry to cut that bit short. So could I ask Rishan Patel to come up next?
Hello everyone, I'm Rishan and I'm from UCL, the Triple E department. Please don't hold that against me. And I am going to talk to you about my project. There's a lot of jargon here, so hopefully by the end of it you understand most of it. Cool, so one of the things in the title was brain-computer interfacing. Question is, what is that? Really good graphic here of someone using a BCI. And you might have heard of BCIs in the media. You might have heard of, again, don't hold this against me, but Elon Musk's Neuralink, one of my favorite people. Or like there's another company called Synchron. They've had this really interesting Stentrode. Either way, these are brain-computer interfaces. And what's really cool is they allow you to convert neural signals into some actionable command. You could control your phone by thinking, or you could, in this case, think about moving your arm, and you could be a paralyzed patient, and you can like use some exoskeleton or some sort of assistive technology to allow you to help you to move. So I'm going to take kind of a step back. I'm going to kind of go, what are the current focuses of BCI research? And decoding movements is a really big one. So imagine if you were paralyzed and you wanted to think about moving your left hand or your right hand. Clinical trial and use, so there's different kind of uses of EEG BCI. It doesn't have, there's like 5 pillars, which is restore, enhance, improve, a couple others. And there's BCI for research. And the goals, I think these are some really good goals that my research particularly aligns with. And that's BCI for rehabilitation at home, there's plug and play for research, and wearable devices. I'll kind of get onto why those are goals and not actually real in the next slide. But there's really good reasoning for it. So there's this concept called drift. It's a textbook definition in machine learning or computer science community is when the statistical properties of training data differ from testing data. Basically, all that is if you teach something on one piece of information and you test it on another, it's going to fail. Like that's just, it makes sense, right? So brain signals are non-stationary. The EEG signals that we measure, the surface EEG signals that we measure, are non-stationary. And that means that you can measure them at any different point in time, and they will be different every time. And we can attribute this non-stationarity to 3 kind of main points. We can start with ALS progression in my end user group, which is one of the other words from my title, which is amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. It's a progressive neurodegenerative disease, and it renders people quickly unable to have any motor function. So the changes that occur because of this disease, there's evidence to show there's cortical reorganization in the brain, there's degradation of the cortical neurons, and for that reason we can't get some sort of volitional modulated signal from the brain. And that kind of is a problem in the BCI community. And that's a source of non-stationarity. So there's learning, which now we're going away from ALS specifically, and that's anyone. So if you wanted to use a BCI, learning would get you. It's BCI-related plasticity, the effect of learning, and we're measuring the signal that we're changing. And setup inconsistency. So that could be like you put on this cap that measures the signals, and you could put them on a very slightly different location every time. That will affect the signal. So those are all reasons that, well, that's the reason that I've chosen to particularly focus on. Those are reasons that BCIs don't really work as well, and that's why the kind of vision is, why is it all the way up there? It's like kind of BCI for rehabilitation at home. Right now, you do it in a research setting, in a laboratory, and you'd have an expert to recalibrate classifiers and so on. So the solutions, or 3 potential solutions, can't walk over there, is let the machines learn. That'd be the first one. And in this case, we mean the BCI user, we assume that the BCI user is constant and the system changes. But we already know that's not true because of non-stationary signals. The BCI user is adaptive. There's the operant conditioning approach, which also doesn't work because of non-stationary signals. So the BCI system is outdated. And we finally get to optimized co-adaptation, which is this mutual adaptation between the classifier and the user. The potential of this paradigm is longitudinal usage, plug and play usage, and in the home usage. If you have a classifier that adapts to you at all times, you don't need an expert to come and recalibrate. You don't need someone to teach you how to use it. You can kind of get by and have it connect to this assistive technology, whichever use case you want, and it'll work, which is ideally the goal. So my objective for my PhD is to develop and validate these co-adaptive frameworks, and that kind of will allow this longitudinal usage and adaptation over time. And hopefully that allows some control of an assistive technology. So the current work that I've been doing, if it goes. So I've got a data set of 8 ALS patients, and they complete left or right movement imagery. That's just thinking about moving left or right hands. And you can kind of see an example of what the patients are doing in that top video above. They've got a cursor, and they'll either think of kind of moving it to the left goal or the right goal, and which is really cool because you think about moving, and like you can kind of translate that. So these 8 ALS patients, they have 19 electrodes around the sensory motor cortex, and over 2 months, because the initial goal is kind of adapting over time. So we need some sort of a longitudinal data set, however we define that. So in this case, 16 runs, 4 sessions over 2 months. And this data has been kindly provided by Penn State. So the model that I use is, we don't really need to go into it too much, but it's called Filter Bank Common Spatial Patterns. It's a really heavily used model in the BCI community. So one of the goals was plug and play. And I've tried to abstract at least my model to 2 key parameters. That's the initial data, the calibration data. How many times do I need to think about left or right in order to get this to work? And then the window length for how much data do I need to recalibrate at every time point, or every time the data becomes like too non-stationary. And from here, you can see I think it's quite obvious that you would want the minimal amount of data for both parameters. And you can see that as we get lower, the accuracies actually get lower, which is obviously not good. But there's a nice mid-threshold around 25, 20, which is really only like 10 minutes of training, which is a really, really encouraging thing. Normally, if you do a BCI study, you need maybe like an hour of training and an hour of calibration with someone around you who knows how to do it. Because if I told any of you right now to just think about moving your left or right hand, would you be able to do it? Like just thinking about it and not actually doing anything. No one teaches you anything. Would you guys be able to do it? Yes or no? Any shakes head? No? Probably, yeah? Okay, first, but yeah, it's quite a difficult task typically. At least personally, when I first tried it, it was really difficult. So yeah, the results. So you can see in the top model, this is the non-adaptive model, that over time, over the 2 months, that there is a decrease in accuracy over time. So the goal accuracy that we want is the green line, and that's a 70%, it's called BCI illiterate. I don't know why it's called that. It's not a very nice way of putting it, but. So 70% threshold accuracy, and the average accuracies, you can see that actually fall below that, and they're decreasing over time, which means at each session, each time point that we update, it gets worse and worse, which is not good. So our adaptive model exceeds the 70% threshold accuracy, and on top of that, they sometimes you can see that they get better over time, which is really useful. So this is the first auto-adaptive model tested on ALS patient data, and it showed evidence for adaptation across sessions. And the average accuracies are well comparable to other patient groups in this field. So yeah, that's it, and thank you guys for listening.
Okay, we're getting treated to some amazing talks today. Okay, does anyone have any questions before you run away? We don't have long.
I'm so nervous.
Don't worry. If there's anything, anyone has any burning questions, we can probably take one before we move on to our last talk. Anybody? No.
It's okay, that's better. I'm really nervous. It's going on, Jay. We're good.
I have a very quick one, which was, so obviously in your paradigm, it's quite a simple task, which is like moving that cursor, was it, on the screen? And it obviously was very effective in that, not needing so much training and things like that. Do you think that that would translate to like more complex movements or more complex tasks? Or
the problem with surface EEG is that I don't think that we, in any time soon, will get multi-class in the sense like you'll be able to do 4 different things. I think these kind of binary or 3-class tasks are really simple right now because there's enough control signals that you can get from, let's say, like 19 electrodes. So one of the reasons 19 electrodes is quite easy, or maybe not easy, but like we need at least 10 or 12 of them just to get 2 different classes. Because the way like left or right works is like you measure contralaterally, so like the right side will light up on if you're doing left motor imagery. But then if we add more complexity, the processing gets longer. Also, training people to do completely different things is really difficult. So for many reasons, there's a lot more research to be done.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, just having 3 classes is still really useful. Whether it's like driving a wheelchair, you could simply be able to go left, right, and stop. Like that's not, I guess, ideal, but it's a really good starting point. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you.